and welcome back to the Good Stories Podcast. I'm Jody here with Stephen, and we are recording this episode on the first day of June. So, happy June, brother.
Thank you.
There's a book quote about June that has stuck in my mind for a long time, but I looked it up to make sure I quote it correctly. So, it goes, "And then one fairy night, May became June." I have not read the book that it's from. It's from an F. Scott Fitzgerald, but that line has always stuck with me. It happened to cross it when I was a kid. So one fairy night, May became June. Quite lovely, and I highly recommend just thinking about this month in that context. I love it every year. Anyways, my quick announcement today is that I found some t-shirts. I found some Good Stories t-shirts tucked away under my bookcase. So I thought we should have a giveaway.
I love it. I think it's a great idea. Everyone likes giveaways.
Everyone likes giveaway, and they're nice t-shirts. Our friend Gary at Taiga 2 makes them, and they have our logo on them. They're black. I put a picture of us wearing ours on my link, like we did at Christmas. I want people to go submit a kind of book-related answer. So the question on my little survey is, what's your go-to reread, and why do you come back to it? The other kind of prompt I threw around is your favorite vacation read, but I think that could fall into that same category, potentially.
I think there could definitely be some overlap.
Yeah, so it's a cozy read or a reread, something that you come back to and why. But yeah, I'll put a link in the episode notes here, and we'll announce winners sometime in July. But yeah, I hope people participate. I like hearing from people, and then those t-shirts will not be sitting under my bookcase anymore. I didn't mean to forget about them. I put them somewhere safe. So please join us with that. We'd love you to participate. And then one more thing, our top 5 new download locations this week, spanning the globe again. So we have Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Atlanta, Georgia, Freiburg, Maine, LEJ, Georgia, which is a great name, and Toronto, Canada. So thank you all for listening. And then for today's story, I think it's fair to say that few people have really shaped the way we think about fantasy more than J.R.R. Tolkien. And today we're talking about his essay on the idea of fairy. It's titled On Fairy Stories, where he tries to describe how wonder and enchantment and fairy tales aren't just for children, and why we human beings are often drawn to what he called fairy with an E. So let's jump in. Time for a story.
Asked to deliver the prestigious Andrew Lang Lecture in 1939 at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, J.R.R. Tolkien took the opportunity to deliver a sweeping analysis of fairy story. Subsequently expanded and published in Essays Presented to Charles Williams in 1947, this work remains an insightful and illuminating description of fairy and its powers. This work pulls back the veil on the mind of the greatest fantasy writer of all time, J.R.R. Tolkien.
Fantastic. All right. Spoiler alert. I don't think it's possible to spoil it.
It's not actually a story, so the story summary is not much of a plot summary. It's more of a description.
We picked an essay.
But we have talked about this essay. We have read portions of this essay already on this show, and it just seemed time. It seemed time to talk through it because I get more out of this every time I read it.
Yeah, it is. I think of it as kind of a framework on which we can look at stories that we talk about. And I constantly do, actually. Pieces of this essay pop into my head. But Stephen said we should do an easy one this week. And then he said on fairy stories. I did not think this was an easy one to prep for.
Perhaps I should have used the word shorter.
Shorter, yes.
It's shorter than some of the books. But yeah, you're right. It was not easy. And in fact, as I was doing my outline for this, I find I'm still a little bit scattered. But I'm excited about that because that means that I think we're going to learn together as we go through this because each one of us is going to have grabbed different things out of it.
It's true. All week long, I've been thinking about it. And I had thoughts on it, but there were too many and too all over the place to write down. So this one's just kind of organic.
I love it.
We're just going to do it. So it was a lecture, then an essay, and then it was published again with Leaf by Niggle in the 1960s, I think. Mm-hmm. And they were paired together. So, I mean, it really is presented as an essay. It feels academic in nature when you read it, but then it's paired with the story that I don't think they were written together at all.
No.
But it really supports kind of the essence of what he's saying. And I love that pairing together. So Leaf by Niggle we did way back at the beginning. What, episode 3 or 4?
I think it was our second actual story.
It's a fantastic story, though. Go read that one.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody would love to read the essay, but again, if you can think about it as kind of that support and framework for story, it is wonderful.
Yeah, I would agree. And I do think the background on this essay is worth going into a little bit more because it touches on some pretty important things and pretty important people. So Andrew Lang is a name that we have referenced frequently because he's the one who compiled the fairy books. The Blue Fairy book is the one that I recommend, but they're all good, is my understanding. Tolkien at one point says that he was born around the time the Green Fairy book was released, so it was kind of fitting for him. And yeah, Andrew Lang was so important that St. Andrews University in Scotland hosts an annual lecture. And many famous people have been asked to lecture, but this is probably the most famous of the speeches coming from it. Because most people who lectured, I guess, spoke mostly about Andrew Lang. Tolkien, like he always does, went bigger, and he talked about fairy story full stop. But then the way this actually got into a published work, I find fascinating as well. We have talked about Charles Williams, one of the Inklings, a good friend of C.S. Lewis, and actually several of the Inklings who died right at the end of World War II. This was originally published in what was going to be something called, and this is a fun word, a Festschrift.
Oh my, what's that?
I apologize to the Germans. I'm sure that's pronounced incorrectly. It literally means celebration writing. And this was initially intended to be a collection of essays to present to him when he kind of left Oxford and went back to London after the war. Well, he died, so that never happened. And so then Lewis particularly spearheaded this, came up with the idea of, well, let's do this anyway, let's publish it, and then all the money can go to Charles Williams' widow. And a lot of work went into this. So Lewis did a couple pieces for it. Tolkien did this piece. Dorothy Sayers did a piece. There were several famous people who contributed to it. It sold almost nothing. I don't think it got the widow Williams any money. It was not successful in any way. But this particular essay really took fire, and especially when it was published later in Tree and Leaf, when it was published with Leaf by Niggle.
What did Lewis put in? Do you know?
I think Lewis actually did two pieces, if I remember correctly. He did, I think, a brief kind of biopic on Charles Williams. I think he described his life a little bit. And then he also did an evaluation of some of his Arthurian poetry.
So did it not sell? I guess I'm testing you on things you probably don't know. Did it not sell because Charles Williams was more famous than the people who contributed then?
Then some of the people were then. Certainly Williams at the time was more famous than Lewis. I think it didn't sell because it was a charity work. I don't think it got a whole lot of publicity. And I mean, let's face it, scholarly essays on literature probably don't have a wide market. So I don't think it ever went up off the ground.
Man, I'd buy it.
Yeah.
Are you kidding? It doesn't even matter if I like those. I would buy that. But
Yeah, well, to have something with Tolkien, Lewis,
Yeah.
Sayers, I mean, yes. But no, it was not successful, is my understanding.
no, I didn't know that. And well done on the German.
I'm sorry, Germany.
So inside of this essay, Tolkien references many German fairy tales. And throughout, I realized I wasn't going to try to say them.
Well, what do you think? Shall we start with the opening line?
Well, I guess one more thing on the book. I'm a little surprised it wasn't successful because The Hobbit would have come out before then. And it really was. It took off. But that, again, is a story. So maybe it was just on a different shelf at the bookstore or something.
I think so.
Interesting. Yes. Let's read the beginning because it's really great.
And I think I've read this before because this is just beautiful. I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I am aware that this is a rash adventure. Fairy is a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And overbold I may be accounted, for though I have been a lover of fairy stories since I learned to read, and have at times thought about them, I have not studied them professionally. I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in the land, full of wonder, but not of information. The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted. Beauty that is an enchantment. And I could just keep reading because this is wonderful, but I should probably not read the whole essay.
Go to the end of that paragraph.
The realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted. Beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril. Both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates be shut and the keys be lost.
It is a big beginning and wonderfully told as the beginning of a story, but like I said, it's not a story, it's an essay. And I got to be honest, when I first read this, I remember distinctly that you told me to read it, and I tried. I had a Tolkien reader that included this in it. I was on the subway in Boston, and I was going to read this. I was so excited about it because I love the premise and the prompt. But the heft of his words when he gets all academic, hard to read for me.
He does get academic, but it's going to be fun for us to trace his words because he does lay out a plot here. He does lay out a skeleton of what he proposes to speak about. He has really 3 big questions. What are fairy stories? What is their origin? And what is the use of them? And that is sort of the skeleton that he hangs this essay on.
I love this because for sure he was way more well-read than I am. And I feel like I've read a lot of fairy stories. He basically uses the stories that he knows, primarily from the stories themselves, that he extracts this information, the few of all their multitude that I know. He acknowledges just how much more out there is. Absolutely.
It is so huge. The definition was something I was really looking forward to come up with what was his definition of fairy stories going to be. And as we talk about this first section, we'll see if we can come up with an answer to that question. But he doesn't start with his own definition. He starts with looking to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, which many people will know that he actually worked on. He did a lot of the W words like walrus, which is sort of fun. But anyway, he says for that, we actually look in vain. He says it doesn't give a definition. And he talks about a supplement later on that gave some sort of definition, but he didn't think it was very helpful, for it gave 3 things. A fairy story is a tale about fairies, or generally a fairy legend with developed senses. B, an unreal or incredible story. And C, a falsehood. And he says, well, those last 2 are worthless. That there's no way he can talk about all falsehoods or incredible stories. So he is really focusing kind of on the idea of fairies in general. But even that he kind of struggles with.
Yeah, the quote there is supernatural beings of diminutive size in popular belief, supposed to possess magical powers and have great influence for good or evil over the affairs of man. He was a philologist. Words mattered to him, and the development of words mattered to him. He really focuses on the diminutive and how unfair that is.
Oh, he hates it.
Not a thing about fairies.
It's not just that they're short. And he tries to trace where that comes from. He refers to a book called, I have it written down here, Michael Drayton's Nymphidia, starring the heroic knight fairy Pigwiggan. And later I've heard him talk about pigwidgeonry as sort of a disparaging term for this idea of these tiny, cute, small fairies. He really didn't like that at all.
Well, and famously, he wasn't a fan of how Disney conveyed fairies and story in general. Even in here, he kind of disparages Shakespeare.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's always these small fairies, and they take residence in like a flower or something, and they're kind of silly and songy. And for him, the word fairy, spelled with an E. Every time I look at fairy spelled with an E, it makes me think of Anne of Green Gables.
Oh, yeah.
And with an E.
How delighted would she be to know that every time you see the word fairy, you think of her?
That was one of my thoughts this week. And because Anne, if you don't know Anne of Green Gables, go watch was it PBS version from the 80s with Megan Follows? Fantastic. I actually watched it recently, and it's always Anne with an E. Any other version, I cannot promise is good or not, don't know, but the old one, sidebar, it's fantastic.
Agreed. So small fairies, diminutive fairies,
Sorry,
he doesn't
brother.
like. No, this is great. The other word that he takes issue with is supernatural, because he says that's misleading too. In fact, he believes that the fairies, if anything, are more natural than we are, that they're a part of nature. And so he doesn't like them described as supernatural. He doesn't like them described as diminutive, but he clearly loves them. He inserts another poem, and he just picks such good stuff. This poem I had to look up, and I found it. This is from Thomas the Rhymer, a poem by Sir Walter Scott. And I'll just read this because this is fun too. O see ye not yon narrow road, so thick beset with thorns and briars. That is the path of righteousness, though after it but few inquires. And see ye not yon braid road that lies across the lily laven. That is the path of wickedness, though some call it the road to heaven. And see ye not yon bonny road that winds about yon ferny brae. That is the road to fair Elfland, where thou and I this night maun gae. This reminds me so much of the way Lewis talks about the kind of the in-betweeners. In his book, Discarded Image, he talks about the longawi, the long livers, these sort of in-between spirits that aren't really good and aren't really bad, but are somewhere in the middle. In this passage, they're referred to as bonny, right? And it's not the road of righteousness. It's not the road of wickedness. It's something else entirely. And this is kind of that perilous land into which we are journeying.
So as he goes through the structure of this, he pairs a lot of stories. He tucks in references to stories, and I was quite pleased that I know a lot of them. But I did not know Thomas the Rhymer, and I looked it up. Do you know this one?
I didn't, but I looked it up and read the poem once I
so
came across
fun.
this. Oh, yeah.
Basically, the Queen of Elfland takes him to fairy, and that's what she points out these three different paths. So kind of the narrow road to heaven, that broad road to hell, and then this secret kind of winding path to fairyland. And you've used the phrase on this podcast before with fairy, the idea of the other. It's not good. It's not evil. There are both good and evil in fairyland, but it's something else entirely. It's something other than either of these other two roads. And even in the Bible, when Jesus says, how could I speak to you of things of the Spirit? I'm not claiming that's fairyland. Please don't think that. But the idea that there is more than just black and white, good and evil, strict lines for everything. It's this other kind of space of its own that it occupies. And I think this Thomas the Rhymer is really interesting. When he's released from fairyland, just a side note, he's given a gift. Or is it? He is not allowed to lie. That's interesting. It's like this burden, but also a gift, as many things from fairyland are. That was so cool. Thomas the Rhymer. Look it up.
Because I think they call him True Tom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, he can't lie.
It says there's all these legends that grow around him when he comes back. He's like this prophet poet guy, just from this little phrase from Tolkien in here. And that's what that soup of story is. I didn't know that one, and it's really cool.
Yeah. The more I read Tolkien's words, I read his letters, I read his works, he's a fairly curmudgeonly individual to my assessment as I'm reading through. I love him, but he definitely has things that he does not approve of and that he speaks against and criticizes. But here, for the first time, we actually see him speaking about something in a positive sense towards this. So he's gotten rid of the supernatural, got rid of the diminutive, but what he talks about is really kind of the first reference to fairy that he can find, and it's by a poet named Gower. It says, it's taken from the poet Gower as he were a fairy. But the way he's reading this, the way this is really would be translated in modern English is as if he were come from fairy. So fairy is not the race, at least not in this sense. It's a place, it's a location, it's a thing, it's an other. And Tolkien, I do think, really leans into that concept.
Yeah, and this idea, that little word of, to be of fairy as opposed to a fairy himself. I think it's common to think of fairies like Tinkerbell. I don't know. Can you think of just a generic fairy that someone would think of as a fairy?
Tinkerbell is absolutely the first one that would come to my mind.
We recently did Peter Pan, and she's not super nice.
No. And in fact, she totally fits that pigwidgeonry like model, this diminutive, cute little fairy, which Tolkien was not fond of.
And very sparkly.
Very sparkly.
But he's talking about the of fairy here, fairy with an E. At least part of the magic that they wield for the good or evil of man is power to play on the desires of his body and his heart. And that's, again, comes back to that Thomas the Rhymer, where they have, or they can participate in things of man, even though they are separate. So they're not completely separate, even though they are other. It's both.
Yeah, very much so. He also talks here about how he thinks that most fairy stories, or at least the good ones, are not so much about fairies, but about the adventures of men in fairy. It's that sort of power, that magic that happens. I mean, he says, the magic of fairy is not an end in itself. Its virtue is in its operations. Among those are the satisfaction of certain primordial human desires. And then he goes on to list a few of those or those different things. So yeah, that concept of this magic, this power, this place, and the effect that can have it on the men in it is really interesting.
So going through this, I tried to just come up with stories that would fit according to Tolkien's description of fairy and things that wouldn't. And I think magic is too broad to just fit inside of it, because there are many instances. I mean, I don't think of Star Wars as a fairy story, but presumably there is power, there is magic there. Harry Potter, I don't know. I went through many different iterations of just stories I know, and whether he would say they do or don't fit into the category of fairy.
Well, there are some he clearly said wouldn't. He is really pretty slow to come up with his own definition here, but there are certain things he's willing to cast down. So are you familiar with the via negativa? Have you heard that term in theology?
I have, but tell me.
So the via negativa, as you know, is basically the fact that we can't actually say anything positive about God. All our words fall short, and so they're all technically lies. I mean, even saying things like God is good, according to this school of thought, is so far short of how truly good he is that it might as well be a lie. So we can't really say anything definitive about him. But what we can say are negative things. We can say that he's not evil, right? We can say that he's not mortal. Well, Jesus became more. But anyway, so it's this idea of using negation, and by negation trying to find something out about it. That's kind of what I feel like what Tolkien's doing here with fairy stories. Yeah. And so there's a few that he uses to kind of illustrate his purpose. So one of the big categories is traveler's tales. He's talking about the Andrew Lang books at the Andrew Lang lecture and criticizing him for the works that he selected.
He says nice things about some of them.
He does too. He does indeed. Yeah, he did not think A Voyage to Lilliput should be in the book. He thought that's a traveler's tale. It's not a fairy story. He also highlighted things like The First Men in the Moon and The Time Machine, some of these science fictions by H.G. Wells, that he didn't think should be in fairy stories because they're traveler's tales. He also has a really big problem with dream as a tool. Now, you can have dreams within fairy stories, and fairy is certainly dream-like, but he discounts Alice in Wonderland as a fairy story. He likes Alice in Wonderland. He's not disparaging the book, but he just doesn't think it's a fairy story because the whole framing of it is purely as a dream device, and so he doesn't like that. And then the last one that he chucks out are the beast fables. He says stories that could be about humans, but they just make it about animals instead, those don't count. He doesn't think those are fairy. And so he talks about
like
several. Yeah, or Brer Rabbit. He talks about Peter Rabbit. He talks about Reynard the Fox, which was a kind of a medieval version of that. And then he talks about a Swahili tale, The Monkey's Heart, how all these things really are just beast fables. They're not really of fairy. I do enjoy, though, that he does a digression on that one that brings in George MacDonald. Because in the past, you had asked me at one point if Tolkien had read George MacDonald and liked him. And I think I had said, yeah, he had read him and he liked some of the stuff he did. And so I was reaffirmed when I read through this, when I heard him talking about him in mostly positive terms. So he liked The Giant's Heart, which is a story that we've talked about on this show.
He mentions the giant's heart, but there's another instance of a Scottish tale where the heart is detached from a body. So I wondered if MacDonald had actually used that concept, but I don't know what tale that was.
He talks in length about actually a very old Egyptian tale, the tale of the two brothers, where this happens.
Oh, here it is. The notion that life or strength of a man or creature may reside in some other place or thing, or in some part of the body, especially the heart, that can be detached and hidden in a bag, or under a stone, or in an egg. For instance, it's the tale of the two brothers. That's the Egyptian one that he's talking about.
Yep.
Where the younger brother says to the elder, I shall enchant my heart, and I shall place it upon the top of the flower of the cedar. Now the cedar will be cut down, and my heart will fall to the ground, and thou shalt come to seek it, even though thou pass 7 years in seeking it. But when thou hast found it, put it into a vase of cold water, and in very truth I shall live. So I am not familiar with the two brothers, but that seems like an odd plan, where he knows the tree's going to get cut down. It's going to take you 7 years, but you'll come for me, right?
I think this one smacks of fairy in a way that some of the other ones don't. And that brings us within one paragraph of the end of his discussion about the definition of fairy story. And what I realized and what I marked with many little stars in my notes, he never gives a definition. He shoots down some other things. He describes things that it's not. He describes some things that are kind of the flavor of a fairy story. But Tolkien himself in this work that I could find never actually gives a true definition of what a fairy story is.
He doesn't say it explicitly, but there are two words that I think nail it, and they are in this section. Imagined wonder. The whole statement is the realization, independent of the conceiving mind, of imagined wonder. He doesn't say, this is what I think of as fairy story, but I think that nails it. Imagined wonder. Because it has to be, well, we'll talk more about it. It has to be believable inside of its own world. We get to that later. But this idea of wonder and delight and kind of joy and pain together, those opposite things that we feel inside. But as an example, I'm actually reading a Russian author right now where he's describing this old man and this old woman who lived this wonderful life together, a simple life. And he does a pretty good job actually of describing this life. But in the end, it doesn't have that poignancy of people you know. I hope you know some people who've lived a long, wonderful life together and they grow old together. And that's something we feel inside of us. And I think fairy has to include that wonder and that kind of heart pull that makes you feel something about something that in this world is fairly ordinary. But in fairyland, it's exceptional.
I love the way you pulled out those words because I think you're right. Because later on, when he's talking and defining about fantasy, I'm getting ahead of myself here and we'll come to this, but he defines fantasy as the subcreative art linking a quality of strangeness and wonder. And so that to me was the closest I got to a definition when he's talking about fantasy later. And I think that ties in directly to what you just saw in those two words there in this first section.
Well, an imagination has to be part of it. It's things that are beyond our normal. That imagination is truly a requirement for all of these stories. That is a component.
Yeah, I think so too.
Sorry, I just have thoughts as we go along here, so...
No apologies. Please keep sharing them.
Stick to the essay. I'll just go random.
Well, he goes into origins next. And this I really enjoy because there's several points he does want to make here and make fairly strongly. The first thing is he does this whole differentiation between fairy stories and fairy elements. These parts of the story. So like the idea of the heart being separated from the body, right? The source of life. That's an element in fairy stories, but that doesn't necessarily tell us the origin of the stories themselves. And he's very clear that similarities in elements do not require similarities in origin. They can come from different places and from different times. And this is where he first talks about that soup of story, which is a term we've used and I love and I think is brilliant. So what does he mean by the soup of story?
In essence, anyone who creates something contributes to this soup. Okay, they put things into the soup and then others take elements out, but then they add their own pieces. Cooking is a great illustration for it, actually. And that totally takes me to Smith of Wood and Major. Because I wondered, why is it about a cook? That's so random. But it's this adding and subtracting that we can all make a soup. Even if you can't cook a thing, you can make a soup. But people who are good at it can take out elements, and it's going to be similar to other soup you've had. But it won't be the same once you've added your piece. And that is the soup.
I love that, and I think that is so true. I love how he describes it as a long alchemic process of time, that this simmering of the soup of story takes time for things to come out. And he quotes another authority, but he kind of takes his words and applies them to his own purpose. This other guy says, we must be satisfied with the soup that is set before us and not desire to see the bones of the ox out of which it has been boiled. And he says, though, this guy was talking about a mishmash of bogus prehistory, so he doesn't really agree with his things, but he does talk about how this desire to see the bones is not necessarily helpful or good. He does say, by the soup, I mean the story as it is served up to its author or teller, and by the bones, its sources or material, even when, by rare luck, these can be with certainty discovered. So again, he's not a big fan of necessarily really trying to hunt down the bones. But he does say, but I do not, of course, forbid criticism of the soup as soup.
You have to do something good with it. It's like a song. If you're going to cover a song or remake a song, you have to make it as good or better than the original. Otherwise, why do it? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of that idea of the bones of it. He also calls it the tree of tales. And I feel this one deep because I know kids now who love, Percy Jackson. I got no problem with Percy Jackson. I have no problem. I have no problem with Percy Jackson and the Greek myths as part of it. But you should know that that's connected to other stories. You don't need to know every single one to just enjoy Percy Jackson, but to know that there's more is a gift and an opportunity. And I think part of why I like doing this podcast, brother, because I learn new stories, or better yet, old stories. Like Thomas the Rhymer.
Yes.
Had no idea. The Black Bull of Norway comes up in this one, which I had forgotten about. And he even says the Black Bull of Norway is basically Beauty and the Beast. Mm-hmm. But it isn't.
They're
not the same because of that soup. It was extracted and changed. They are not the same.
He does talk about the possibilities in the way that this soup, the way this web, the way these things get shared. And I thought this was a useful way of thinking about it. He talks about that a story can come from, independent evolution or invention, right? Somebody can just come up with a story. But more often than not, there is that web. There are these connections. And he talks about that, how that can happen in two other different ways. There can be inheritance or common ancestry, which he summarizes as borrowing in time, kind of this vertical borrowing from that which has gone before in these stories. He also talks about diffusion, which he describes as borrowing in space, borrowing from other cultures, other people, other things around you, more this horizontal borrowing. And that's very useful. But one of the things he clearly points out is that second and third doesn't really answer the question of where the stories came from, because it just pushes it further back. Because at some point, the story had to be actually invented in its own right. And this is also where he gets to talk about his deep and abiding love of philology. He says that philology has been dethroned from the high place it once had in this court of inquiry. But then he also uses this to take a jab at another guy he doesn't think much of. Says Max Muller's view of mythology as a disease of language can be abandoned without regret. So that's a zinger.
You have to finish it. Mythology is not a disease at all, though it may, like all human things, become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. That's excellent, where he takes it that further step of, well, thinking on itself has to be a thing if we can get to a disease of the mind. You can't have a disease of the mind without thinking, but it is false logic to say that thinking is a disease of the mind.
Yeah.
All thinking diseased. No, not so. I love so many parts of this. I struggled to read it the first time, but that was 20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
I've read it several times since, and each time I get more. So he talks about language and mythology and how rich those are, and how we as people, this gift of our mind is that, like, if you describe green grass, we can see that, and we can also describe more things about it. The mind that thought of green grass is also the mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift. It's also the mind that conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into swift water. He does these wonderful add-ons to things that we already know. Simple things, green grass, light, heavy, simple adjectives. And then he adds this richness when our mind can conceive of something greater, can imagine something more wonderful.
And I had never thought about it in this way before, the sheer power of adjectives. I mean, this man loved language. And what he's saying is that there's some magic to that. Because if you have green grass, well, what's to stop you from making other things green? Putting a green sun in the sky, right? I mean, there's just tremendous power in the ability to describe things and to separate these adjectives from the nouns and then be able to mix them up and match them up. And there's a line in here in the end of that paragraph that has always stuck with me, where he talks about this power. He says, we may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine, or we may cause woods to spring with silver leaves and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm. That last one, hot fire into the belly of the cold worm. And this is where we get dragons. It's all this power of language, this power of adjective. And he clearly loves it, and his love of it is contagious.
But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. Fairy, with an E, begins. Man, we become sub-creators.
And what an important word that is. That's the first place we see it in this, but it's not going to be the last. The idea of a sub-creation under the great creation, that we are sub-creators under the creator, is really a pivotal point of his thought. And he describes that, an essential power of fairy is thus the power of making immediately effective by the will the visions of fantasy. He says they're not all pretty. Many of them aren't. But there's this concept of kind of will and that power that goes with it, which is just staggering to think about. He then goes on at some length about some of the other theories of origin. And one of the ones that I grew up reading lots of books was the concept of kind of the nature myths, that all fairy tales and mythology and folklore was all just nature myth, and that those tales came first, and then over time they kind of developed into the idea of these fairy tales or stories. But he shoots that down pretty fast and says, if anything, he thinks it's the other way around. You can't have a story when it's just nature. There has to be a person. There has to be a Thor to tell stories about Thor and then to hook lightning to him. If you just have lightning, you're not going to have Thor.
He says Thor would be not interesting at all if he didn't have a personal element. And putting that into fairy, I'd never thought of the Norse myths as fairy tales. They totally are if you think about them the way Tolkien did. And every single one of those Norse gods has a personal element. And in their way, they're all fallen. None of them are great. Think of the Greek gods. They're all really messed up, but they can go on for a long, long time. But it's this demonstration of people things that has way more than it's a demonstration of thunder and lightning.
Mm-hmm. And I love some of the thoughts that he throws out in here because, again, I don't feel like this is terribly compact and organized, but it is a journey through some of his kind of rambling thought process, and it's wonderful because he talks about these sort of, primitive tales, these sort of lower tales as the way. Now, he doesn't think there's lower and higher, but at some point he does mention that something really higher is occasionally glimpsed in mythology, and he talks about divinity. And I love his definition of this. He calls it the right to power as distinct from its possession. The that do worshipped, in fact, religion. And he goes on at some length about how Andrew Lang and many folklorists and mythologists separate the two, how they split religion and myth. And he's got kind of a problem with that, if I'm reading this correctly. What he says is they may have been split, but they seem to always be trying to come back together and trying to link together again. And he again goes through this really logical kind of step. He talks about the three faces of fairy story. He talks about the mystical, which is toward the supernatural, the magical face, which is toward nature, and the mirror of scorn and pity towards men, these three faces. And he says that the most important of these is the magical. This is the essential one you have. This face towards nature is really what makes it a fairy story. But he says the other two can be done in different degrees. You can have more or less of the mystical and the mirror. And this, again, is where he talks about George MacDonald. And he says George MacDonald really, really does a lot of the mystical. And I love how he describes it. He says where he succeeds, like in The Golden Key, or when he partly fails, like in Lilith. And we're going to have to do both those stories at some point.
But he points out that George MacDonald calls Lilith a romance, not necessarily a fairy tale. But I love Lilith, for the record, but I'm intimidated to do it, so we haven't yet.
Yeah. Well, the next part I marked, just because I enjoyed it, is the discussion of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the banana
slipping
peel.
on a banana skin.
All right. Has anybody ever actually slipped on a banana peel?
Only in Mario Kart.
Yeah. Okay.
So many banana peels.
Here, I think he's going back to an argument he made earlier, where similarity in elements doesn't necessarily mean common origin or source. And he describes the fact that, if the Archbishop of Canterbury slipped on a banana peel, no one would really doubt it. I might, because I've never seen anyone slip on a banana peel. But he points out that this can happen, and just because that happens in other stories doesn't mean that they share a similarity. But then the more detail you add on, the more that kind of changes the picture and changes the story. And he again, compares several other stories saying that, just because these have similar comparisons doesn't mean they have the same origin. And he talks about them all having been thrown in the cauldron of story. And then out pops Arthur. Out pops whoever. And he says that it's no worse for the Archbishop of Canterbury to be in the cauldron because it's a mighty place to be with such characters as Arthur in there.
Like you said, this segment I feel like is a little random, but my thoughts on this story are random on his essay. So I think it's amazing he pulled it all together in any kind of cohesive way because it goes so many different directions, that tree of tales. And here he's giving examples of things of fairy. And he says, basically, is there love in this fairy story merely mythical? I think not. History often resembles myth because they're both ultimately of the same stuff. And again, I like with Thor, where there's this personal element because it's reflecting something about real people, even though it's projected on this story, this character outside of us, who in many ways is bigger and bold, well, especially Thor. Mm-hmm. But even in love stories, right? There's so much more so than we would feel day to day. Even in a happy marriage, it's such a poignant way of looking at things. And so it's not that myth and history are mutually exclusive. There's this interconnectedness, just like fairyland has this interconnectedness to the broad road of hell and the narrow road of heaven.
Yeah, and that power that comes from the storytelling part of it, that makes it a story, that makes it more potent and more powerful. He talks about the spell of story, and he says, this is a great line, small wonder that spell means both a story told and a formula of power over living men. I mean, there is something to the words of this, and that does make it deeper, sharper, more poignant than kind of our day-to-day lived experience.
I love this line. He says, such stories, because he's giving all these examples and of how the cooks of the soup, they have to carefully select the parts they pull out. That is very important as well. But he says, such stories have now a mythical or total unanalyzable effect, an effect quite independent of the findings of comparative folklore, whatever that is. What is comparative folklore? I'm not done with my quote, but what is that? He capitalizes it.
Yeah, is kind of scientifically looking at stories. So categorizing, grouping them, and trying to see these connections and sources and development. And it's sciencing it up, I think.
Looking at the bones.
Yeah, looking at the bones.
So he continues on, though, and says, these stories, they open a door on other time. That's capitalized too, on other time. And if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time, outside time itself, maybe. I love that as just the concept of escaping through reading. And we can talk more about that word, because he mentions it too, escapist reading. But where you're detached from something, you're detached from your own experience, and you're experiencing this story. Going back to Fantastes, where he's in the library and he just lives the books as he reads them. You get a glimpse of that with these old stories that have stood the test of time, that are still around, even though they were told or written so long ago. Even for a moment, you might live in them.
Yeah. Keep that thought close, because when we get to the discussion of fantasy and primary and secondary worlds and primary and secondary belief, that is going to be such a big factor. But he doesn't jump into that quite yet. After Origins, he jumps into another thing he disagrees with. So before we move on to that, anything else on this Origins chapter that you wanted to talk about?
I just love the span of stories he includes. So the Eddas in here, old fables, all these wonderful things. Arthur's in here, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but also Peter Rabbit. And he says, the gentlest nursery tales know it. There's some taboo, there's some prohibition in the story, something you're not supposed to do. There's still rules in fairyland. Peter Rabbit was forbidden a garden, lost his blue coat, and took sick. The locked door stands as an eternal temptation. At every level of story. The next heading is children.
And this is where he moves into the third question, because he said there were third questions that he was going to build this speech on. So the first was, what is a fairy story? I still don't know, but I feel like I have a better understanding of it. The origins of fairy story, I still don't know, but I'm convinced that maybe I shouldn't really care so much about that. And now he's moving into, what are fairy stories good for? And he says that, well, in general, most people just assume that what they're good for is children. That's it. That children somehow are supposed to like them, that all children love them. And he takes very, very direct umbrage with this. He says, actually, the association of children and fairy stories is an accident of our domestic history. Fairy stories have in the modern lettered world been relegated to the nursery, as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because the adults do not want it and do not mind if it is misused. That's a great quote.
It is. And he describes how kids, they don't even get to vote. They're a captive audience. And nurses, moms, dads, they need something to occupy the kids' time. So over time, they have kind of mutated into this idea that they're for children. But he does say kids also ask good questions. But he takes offense, as you say, umbrage at the idea that adults cannot read them for themselves. That's preposterous.
Yeah. This is one of the nice things he says about Andrew Lang, because he refers to these nurseries essentially as kind of lumber rooms of stories, right? These places where stories are just kind of stored until they're wanted later. He says, though, that Andrew Lang's fairy books are not perhaps lumber rooms. They are more like stalls in a rummage sale. Someone with a duster and a fair eye for things that retain some value has been around the attics and box rooms. His collections are largely a byproduct of his adult study of mythology and folklore, but they were made into and presented as books for children. I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it.
There's a footnote.
By Lang and his helpers, it is not true of the majority of the contents in their original or oldest surviving forms.
They're modified for children.
Yeah.
And I think that is true. If you go to a bookstore today and you go find a book of fairy tales, they're often modified. They're gentled down, which is interesting because I think that's more an adult thing to modify, to render something simpler, kind of whitewash it. I think kids don't mind hearing stories about death or any hard thing. They have questions about it for sure. but they certainly don't seem to mind.
Tolkien would certainly agree with you on that. There's a few other things I wanted to say at the first part of this, but at the end of this chapter, he criticizes another author who did exactly that, who forbid the scary parts of the story to be read. And he says that a man could study fairy stories and not learn better than that seems almost incredible. But neither criticism, rejoinder, nor prohibition would have been necessary if children had not unnecessarily been regarded as the inevitable readers of the books. So what he says is basically that he didn't think those scary things hurt him as a kid. He thinks that it's kind of foolish to do that, and that he can't understand how somebody who spent a life in fairy stories would make that recommendation. Now, he does describe that, like mathematics or science or exercise or anything else, the stories should be given to children according to their abilities. You know, you're not going to throw something totally horrific at a kid, or shouldn't.
Sure.
But that's not what these folks are saying. And so he totally agrees with you, I think, on that point.
I probably agree with him. I mean, if we're looking at the soup, I got that from him.
Well, the other thing he goes into here that I really like is this kind of distinction between belief and what he calls appetite for marvels. So, I mean, an appetite is something that we don't all share the same one. And so whether you're a kid or an adult, you may have an appetite for marvels or not. But belief is something a little bit different. This idea of kind of, is it true? And he goes into this, he uses kids as the springboard here and goes into it in some depth. And he talks about this idea of a primary world and a secondary world. The idea that the primary world is what we live in, it's what's around us. But a secondary world is something that can be created by art. And that's what fairy stories, when done well, become. And he differentiates between this idea of primary belief, right, knowing that we're sitting here, knowing there's a table in front of us, versus this secondary belief, right, believing in the concept that, you know, Ents and Rohan and Gondor and the hobbits all kind of tie together in some way. And this is where he takes his shot at this whole willing suspension of unbelief. I think we've all heard that term. That when you go into a movie or a play or a book, there are some things that you have to just, you know, kind of put your brain to the side, accept the fact that it's not going to really be true, and just enjoy it. And he says that totally takes you out of the world. It totally takes you out of this concept of secondary belief. If it's done right, you shouldn't have to suspend your disbelief because you're just going to be sucked into it.
So he's talking about what a good story maker would prove successful at subcreating. He says he makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed, and then you're back in our primary world. He does speak about how kids can perhaps are more willing to play along with these marvels, to inject themselves into these worlds and believe it as true while the story is unfolding. But he says a good sub-creator, that happens to anybody, anyone who has the appetite for it.
Yeah, and he goes back to this idea of, is it true? So, is it true is the great question children ask, Lang said. They do ask that question, I know, and it is not one to be rashly or idly answered. But that question is hardly evidence of unblunted belief, or even of the desire for it. Most often it proceeds from the child's desire to know what kind of literature he is faced with. Children's knowledge of the world is often so small that they cannot judge offhand and without help between the fantastic, the strange, that is rare or remote facts, the nonsensical, and the merely grown-up, that is ordinary things of their parents' world of which still remain unexplored. But they recognize different classes and may like all of them at times. And I think that's a really good point, right? I mean, so the question of is it true is, okay, what kind of book is this?
Yeah, and he says that, at least for his part, when he was a kid, he didn't care if it was possible. If what was happening in the story was possible, he cared about whether it was desirable. And if the story awakened desire, satisfying it while often whetting it unbearably, they succeeded. A desire for something wonderful, something exciting, some grand adventure, then it's a successful story.
Yeah. I never imagined that the dragon was of the same order as the horse, and that was not solely because I saw horses daily, but never even the footprint of a worm. The dragon had the trademark of fairy written plain upon him. In whatever world he had his being, it was an other world, fantasy. The making or glimpsing of other worlds was the heart of the desire of fairy. I desired dragons with a profound desire. That might need to be a tattoo. I desired dragons with a profound desire. But he goes on here, and I think this is important. Of course, I in my timid body did not wish to have them in the neighborhood, intruding into my relatively safe world, in which it was, for instance, possible to read stories in peace of mind free from fear. But the world that contained even the imagination of Fafnir was richer and more beautiful at whatever cost of peril. The dweller in the quiet and fertile plains may hear of the tormented hills and the unharvested sea and long for them in his heart, for the heart is hard, though the body is soft.
Fafnir. Go listen to our episodes on the Eddas. Fafnir's the dragon. He says, a real taste for fairy stories was wakened by philology on the threshold of manhood and quickened to full life by war. So it wasn't that he was only ever reading fairy stories. It wasn't that he didn't study hard at academic things and to make a parallel today, watching the news, reading the newspaper, reading books, nonfiction, things that are of this world and this time. But as he went to war, it says his desire for these stories came to a head, and his love for them and the things that he extracted from them. He's talking about his timid body. And yet he's going to war is when the time that these stories that many would think childish came to a head. And I think that's very important because it's the stuff that matters when life is hard.
Yeah, that's a great point. I also love in this, as another aside, how often he references Chesterton.
Yeah, I was going to mention that there is a kind of, parallel's the wrong word. Chesterton wrote his own essay, what's it called, on fairy?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
It has a very similar title. And that, I think, is the one where Chesterton says, the author G.K. Chesterton says, basically that kids should read stories and know that there are dragons. Not so they're scared, but so that they know they can be defeated.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And the other one he points out, and this goes back to that concept of kind of the scary stuff in fairy stories or the hard stuff. Chesterton describes going to a play and all the children were really disappointed because the bad guy didn't get his comeuppance. And Tolkien in here talks about, and he quotes Chesterton directly, where he says that this is a really interesting thing. He says, for children are innocent and love justice, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy. And I just think that's a great line.
But that's, I think, true for a lot of kids. It's a lot simpler. They can hear a story and they can see, okay, good or bad, that like, this is what's merited. They deserve it, right? Yes, Chesterton, I think, very much understood children.
And Chesterton is just so quotable. I mean, his one-liners are wonderful.
So I have not read all the Andrew Lang color books, but he references a story, The Chronicles of Pantuflia. Do you know that one?
No, I don't.
I think that's in the Lang. I don't know what it is.
I have not read all of Lang either. Okay, so this is all part of, again, answering that third question about kind of what is fairy story good for. And he does this long digression on children, which I think is really, really good. But he does this as a setup into, I think, some of the other things that he thinks fantasy or that fairy stories are good for. And he wants to talk about fantasy, and then he wants to talk about how that applies to three categories: recovery, escape, and consolation. And then this here, as we said earlier, as I said earlier, I think is where he actually does give us a definition of a fairy story. But he does it under this title of fantasy because he talks about subcreation, the idea of making something, imagination. But it has to be more than that. There has to be this subcreative art, but it has to be linked to qualities of strangeness and wonder. And this is how one can generate a secondary world capable of secondary belief. And he describes it as probably the hardest way to do it.
What's the hardest way to do it?
Fantasy. because it's really a challenging art form in terms of words, because you're by definition describing something that's kind of ridiculous, something that's strange and wonderful. And to somehow make that believable, that takes some art.
And some thorough thinking, I think. You'd have to really, to come back to the bones, you'd have to really think through the bones of what you're describing. And because big plot holes, they would knock you out of the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they'd knock you out of that temporary belief, that secondary belief of what's going on. So yeah, I think a careful crafting is so necessary, and how appropriate that Tolkien is the one talking about it, who spent so much time thinking about the structure of his world.
And he does talk in here about how he does think that words, literature is the best medium for this. He doesn't think much of drama, music, drawing, all these kinds of things for the generation of the secondary world, because he thinks that there are capacities of those different art forms that just make it almost impossible to not be broken out of that secondary world. I mean, he describes plays he's seen that the special effects were ridiculous. And I mean, I don't know if he possibly could have imagined, modern cinema, the way TV and stories and things go. So he's pretty on his high horse about written words.
Or Patrick Stewart. He could not conceive of how wonderful Patrick Stewart would be on stage.
That is an excellent point.
I want to point out with recovery, escape, and consolation. And we're going to go through each of those here, and as he does. But he says all three of those things, of which children have, as a rule, less need than other people.
Going back to the fantasy for a moment, though, he does comment how there are those who are kind of malicious against this, who think this is a bad thing. This is a good quote. They therefore stupidly and even maliciously confound fantasy with dreaming, in which there is no art, and with mental disorders in which there is not even control, with delusion and hallucination. So he does speak to the fact that there are those who are simply not willing to even consider this idea of the secondary world, because there's almost this concept that you could get lost in it. And you could give a primary belief to a secondary world. And I think there are dangers here. I think this is part of the peril of fairy. And I think that can go in both directions. I think there are dangers to giving secondary belief to the primary world. And I think there are dangers of giving primary belief to the secondary world. And that's just something that I think is interesting to think about. And I'm going to have to think about quite a bit more.
Can you come up with an example both ways?
Yeah, I think we've all known people who have been so obsessed with like Harry Potter that they convince themselves that they're truly wizards. And sometimes we'll go to places to make that a reality that can be pretty dangerous. Or I think we've known people who get so into Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, but that can take it into sort of dark places and dark things. And so I think that would be an example of giving kind of primary belief to a secondary world.
I thought you were going to say World of Warcraft.
Oh, yeah, that's another really good example.
Stevie's a fan.
I'm
for the
a big
record.
fan.
Yeah, as I am a fan of Harry Potter, I think these things are good to a point, but they can be taken too far.
Yeah. And to give primary belief to those secondary worlds, I think is dangerous. But the flip side is true too. I think this is the danger of like full-on skepticism or things like that. The idea that this world is only a dream, solipsism, the idea that you're the only thing real. I think there are dangers. I mean, I think in some level that's what kind of psychosis is, of giving secondary belief to the primary world. And so I think there's danger in both ways.
Maybe that's a gift of so many fairy stories and fairy tales that they tend to be short. Not all. There are some very long ones. But you're only in them for a little bit. And, I mean, you mentioned Chesterton. He was so good at seeing the wonder in this primary world. Not even imagined wonder, true wonder, that the sky is blue and brown paper is good for drawing on, and the delight of bread and flavor, the marvel of a body that can rest and rise, all these things. Chesterton in particular was so good at just conveying the marvel of our ordinary world, our primary world. And I think for me, going into a fairy story, even for a little bit, and looking at these things that aren't of this world, but when you come back and you can see some of that wonder and it can add to the wonder of where we are here, I think that's a lot of what Tolkien wanted to do with his sub-creations, with his secondary worlds, where you're in them when you're in them and passionate about them. And then when you come back, it adds to your life here.
You could not have done a better summary of recovery. So
thanks for sticking to the essay, brother.
recovery, escape, consolation. What you just described is perfectly recovery. Recovery, I'm reading from the text now, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them as things apart from ourselves. And so he describes this idea, how you see a Pegasus in this secondary world and horses are ennobled in our world. I mean, things like that. Everything you just said. He goes deeper into the Chesterton rabbit hole here and talks about the Morifok concept. We've talked about this in the past.
Yeah, we did a short on it.
Coffee room. If you reverse coffee room, it's pronounced Morifok. And he talks about if you're sitting looking through a window where that's glazed on the outside, you might see that word and it would be wonderful and mystical and magical, even though it's such a common word and a common term. And this, I think, is absolutely the whole point of this. The secondary world is meant to help re-enchant the primary world. So the love of Ents makes us love trees more.
Absolutely. From a very young age, that was true. Well, and even at the beginning of my book, there's a note that Tolkien wrote, and he references a beautiful poplar tree that's cut down, and probably nobody will lament it other than him and a pair of owls. But the man did love trees, and his love of trees has absolutely helped me love trees. I am grieved when they fall. We just had a windstorm. There are some beautiful trees down. Do you know how long that took to grow? But it is part of the process as well. So you get this glimpse at a much longer time frame of trees. And I just love that this curmudgeon of a man would write stories like Roverandom and lament the cutting down of a poplar tree.
Yes. I'll read his line here. And actually, fairy stories deal largely, or the better ones, mainly with simple or fundamental things untouched by fantasy. But these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. For the story maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover, not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine.
I love everything about that. Actually, I think that is a reason to read.
I agree with you. Yeah, recovery is such a beautiful concept, and I had never really thought of it in that term before. The way he defines it and the way he describes it, yes, I have experienced that. I continue to experience that, and I love it. Escape.
Yeah, this one's a little touchy. I talk to people and they now that we do a podcast on books, they apologize to me for not reading more books. Does this happen to you?
No.
Oh, people apologize. I'm like, no, I don't read much. I should. Like, oh yeah, I haven't read it, so I can't listen. Like, we're doing it for you.
Yeah.
And then hopefully spurring you to go do more.
Yeah, to pick the ones that are worth reading for you.
That you'd love. Yes, exactly. But people apologize. You're like, oh, I just read to kind of escape. Like that's some kind of wrong thing to do. And I think his parallel here is good, where he basically says, if someone's in prison, they should want to get out. They should want that. That makes sense. But it's different than a deserter, someone deserting their life. Mm-hmm. So reading to escape and to find things of wonder or joy or even pain, but that bring something good into your mind, into your thinking, into your heart, that's a good thing. That's a good kind of escapist reading. That is someone in prison. It's an extreme example, right, from our day to day. But here You're delving into something that brings you joy, comfort, wonder, re-enchantment. That's a good thing. It's different than deserting your life to go live at Hogwarts.
Totally agree. Confusing the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Entirely separate. And yeah, I'm on board with that. He also talks in this section about how people have told him that, well, these things are come to stay, because a lot of the stories he likes are old or about old things. And once again, he quotes Chesterton, who says that anytime he hears that something has come to stay, he immediately knows it's going to be gone very soon when people are defending it that harshly. And so I love that an author I love loves Chesterton. And so it just makes me happy. But he talks too about this concept of people thinking that like the real world were the robot factories, this industrial revolution, how somehow this is more real, more alive. And this is another quote from this essay that stuck with me from my first reading. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive is a factory chimney compared with an elm tree? Poor, obsolete thing, insubstantial dream of an escapist. I love that.
Fairy stories may invent monsters that fly the air or dwell in the deep, but at least they do not try to escape from heaven or the sea. These go together in my mind. Man, he does such a good job of taking things that, in some ways are nonsensical, right? Imaginary things, but he's so right. A dragon. My imagined dragons. Good. My concept of a centaur is so alive and wonderful. I would love to meet a centaur. And yet in my timid body, I would not. That's terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of juxtaposition between the two of the enticement of these wonderful creatures and how alive they are versus a motor car, versus a car outside or a computer that I look at all day. That is such a wonderful gift to have that depth, to be able to conceive of that and still come back to my day-to-day. It adds to it instead of takes away.
Recovery. Absolutely.
That's my category, I guess.
Well, it's a great category. I think a lot of people reading this essay, though, we're almost done. We're through the meat of this. But if you were to ask, I think, people who had read this essay what they remember from it most striking, I think most people would use the word eucatastrophe.
Indeed.
And this is where we get into the idea of consolation. So what is a eucatastrophe?
Well, you've mentioned it several times. It's this sudden turn, this wonderful grace and truly happy ending that shouldn't have been. It shouldn't have been possible based on the story up to that point. It's the turn. And Tolkien here says fairy tales, it's a requirement. It has to end that way. It's such an interesting word, the eucatastrophe. It's not a pleasing sounding word. For a guy who liked words, it's not a positive thing, because I don't think he means happy ending in that puppies and rainbows and glitter kind of way. But it is this grace-filled moment.
Yeah, his words. Well, he says he makes up the word.
Yeah.
So he coins this one. It is a sudden and miraculous grace never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and in so far is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It's a wonderful concept, and I think it is so true. And that is what he talks about when he's talking about consolation. But that is not actually how he ends this.
Wait. I hearted this paragraph. I must read it. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to or indeed accompanied by tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a peculiar quality.
Love it. Have you read The Black Bull of Norway?
I actually did, just for this, because he brought it up.
Well, he ends this with a quote from that, which I think is beautiful and again demonstrates the eucatastrophe in a small way. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I clamb for thee, the bloody shirt I wrang for thee, and wilt thou not waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her. That's the eucatastrophe.
The Black Bull of Norway, I think my version is different because I don't know the reference to the bloody shirt. The bloody shirt I rang for thee. Does yours include the shirt?
She had to do washing. It was one of the tasks that she had to do.
This is very much a Beauty and the Beast tale. Not exactly the same, for sure. But this woman serves and seeks this man, her prince. But he comes to her first as a black bull. She's a little cheeky.
Yeah.
So gets herself in trouble. But she works for him and waits for him. And it is this anguish thing where 3 nights she waits for him to notice her. But he is, through bewitchment, given a draught and cannot wake. And it's this last night he hears and turns to her. It's very beautiful.
And then we move into the epilogue. So that's the end of the essay, more or less. But in the epilogue, he makes one final point, which I think is, again, joy that's poignant as grief. It is that the great eucatastrophe of human existence, of the world itself, is the Christian story. And it just fits. It just works in every possible way.
The phrase I like with his eucatastrophe, he calls it the consolation of the happy ending. And that is such a part of Christian belief. And here's a quote. He says, "But in God's kingdom, the presence of the greatest does not depress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy still go on and should go on. All tales may come true, and yet at the last, redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them as man. Finally redeemed will be like and unlike the fallen that we know."
Well, Professor Tolkien, I am grateful for the lecture. I am grateful that you reworked this into the essay, and I'm grateful that we still have it. I get more out of this every time I read it, and there is no way we have exhausted the wisdom and the depth of what is written here. But just what we've been able to talk about, I'm going to be chewing on for a long time.
Agreed. And I was thinking about how many stories that I might not label as fairy stories include fairy stories in them. So Arthur, think of Arthur as a construct. Then you have Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The guy can live even though he gets his head chopped off. Okay. This is part of it. Then I went to, well, actually, Anne of Green Gables. The with an E got me there first. But at the beginning, she is this orphan girl living this fairly miserable life, but she lives inside of her imagination. So inside of her story, she has fairy, and it does bring her comfort. Phantastes, obviously, I mean, it has so many nested stories. That's just a George MacDonald thing in general, nested stories. I was thinking about, because we mentioned Harry Potter, they have the Tales of Beetle the Bard.
Yeah.
It's these things that are even outside of the secondary world. It's like a third world inside of it. I thought of Rowsby Wolf and Watership Down and El Harira, because if you make a world, the secondary world has to have all those bones in that construct. So even inside those worlds, there's more stories because they look towards things, towards additional wonder and joy for that world there, which I just think is super cool. Wheel of Time has it. There's so many that have them, right?
Yes, there are.
All right. I have one more fairy tale that I want to read a clip of that I don't think Tolkien mentions this one on fairy stories in his essay, but Sir Orfeo. Sir Orfeo, I believe, belongs very much so in the category of fairy tale.
100%.
And so there's this moment when Orfeo is following the fairy host into this other world. And I'm going to read, this is Tolkien's translation. He says, he, Orfeo, he came into a country bright, as sun on summer's day with light. Smooth and plain and all green it lay. No hill was there nor valley. Amid the land a castle stood, the richest that men deemed good. All its outer wall around was clear and shining crystal found. No man may tell nor think in thought how rich the works that there were wrought. Indeed, it seemed he gazed with eyes on the proud court of paradise. Fairyland.
I love it. J.R.R. Tolkien, I think our readers will know, was a very, very good friend of C.S. Lewis. And I mean, how lucky are we that these two men knew each other? Because the two of them really spurred each other on in many ways. It's been said that The Lord of the Rings never would have been written if it wasn't for the enthusiasm of C.S. Lewis, just telling him how great it was and then talking him into finishing it. But we would not have had C.S. Lewis without Tolkien. Because C.S. Lewis, as a young man, loved story. He loved myth. But he was also a pretty strict rationalist, and he believed they were all lies. He thought they were beautiful, but they were fundamentally not true. He described them as lies breathed through silver. And this came from a conversation that we know about between J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and a man named Hugo Dyson, to throw one more into the mix. Hugo Dyson was another friend of the two of them. C.S. Lewis, in his letters, I believe, describes him as a Christian and a lover of cats. So he must be a good guy.
All good things.
But Hugo Dyson, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien took a walk in 1931, and it was after that Tolkien really, I think, crystallized some of these things he believed about why they're not just lies. And this is where I think a lot of his concept of subcreation came out of. And from this, he actually generated a poem called Mythopoeia that many people may be aware of. It wasn't actually formally published until 1988, but he had wrote it around that time. And the whole point of it is this concept that fantasy is a natural human activity, wherein we practice subcreation as beings made in the image and likeness of the Creator. And the whole poem is definitely worth reading, but within On Fairy Stories, he actually published a small part of it. So this isn't the full Mythopoeia poem, but it's a little bit of it, and I think this is a good way to end by reading this. And again, this is responding to a friend talking about these stories being breathing a lie through silver. Dear sir, I said, although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined, in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Through all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. That right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. And with that, we'll turn the page, and we hope you join us for the next chapter.